Picture this. It's the year 1819, and the royal nursery welcomes a squishy, red-faced baby named Alexandrina Victoria. Nobody at the time could have guessed this baby would one day sit on the throne for over 63 years, outlasting almost every monarch before her and earning the nickname Grandmother of Europe. But along with her crown, her stern stare, and her habit of wearing black for decades, she also carried something a little less regal, a faulty gene that would ripple through Europe like a bad medical subscription service. Now, Queen Victoria herself was not the image of intimidating majesty. At just 4'11" tall, she was shorter than most of her guards and barely taller than her own crown, but what she lacked in height she more than made up for in stubbornness. She was famously temperamental, known for throwing tantrums at court as a young queen and once declaring, "I will be good, but not yet." You could almost hear her Victorian advisors collectively sighing, "We're in for a ride," and a ride it was. She ascended the throne in 1837 at just 18 years old and ruled until 1901, overseeing one of the most transformative centuries in history. Her reign encompassed the Industrial Revolution, the expansion of the British Empire, and more invention and discovery. Telegraphs, railroads, steamships, photography, and even anesthesia all arrived during her time. Unfortunately for her descendants, anesthesia didn't apply to genetics. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, why Queen Victoria's family tree looked like a medical disaster, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Here's the kicker. Tucked away inside Victoria's DNA was a genetic stowaway known as the hemophilia mutation. Hemophilia, for those lucky enough to not be in Victorian medicine, is a condition where blood doesn't clot properly. This is the kind of disorder that turns a paper cut into a murder mystery. It's passed down genetically, usually from mother to son, and in the days before modern medicine, it was practically a death sentence. The really ironic part, Victoria probably had no idea she was carrying it. She just blithely handed it down to her children like an unwanted family heirloom. Forget passing down grandma's china set. Victoria passed down a gene that made every stubbed toe a royal emergency. Now this raises a big question. Where did she even get it? Hemophilia wasn't recorded in the royal family before her, which means she may have been what geneticists call a spontaneous mutation. In other words, her DNA rolled the dice one day and came up snake eyes. So while other monarchs were inheriting castles, thrones, and fancy ermine robes, Victoria got handed a genetic curveball that would go on to wreak havoc across half of Europe's royal households. But at the time, nobody knew this. To the world, Victoria looked like the ultimate symbol of stability. Here was a queen who stayed firmly in power while revolutions toppled thrones across Europe. France kept losing monarchs like car keys, but Victoria, she just kept showing up in her black dresses, scowling at portraits and outliving almost everyone. Her reign was so long that by the time she died in 1901, entire generations had lived and died never knowing another monarch. She wasn't just a queen, she was basically the wallpaper of the 19th century, everywhere, unchanging and slightly disapproving if you looked too closely. Yet beneath the corsets and crown jewels lurked this medical landmine. The Victorians had no way of understanding it. Genetics as a science was still sitting in a monastery garden with Gregor Mendel, who was probably mumbling to his peas, "Why won't anyone listen to me?" Meanwhile, in Buckingham Palace, Victoria was producing 9 children, blissfully unaware that some of them were ticking medical time bombs. And this is what makes Victoria so fascinating. On one hand, she was the poster child for the grandeur of the age, an empire builder, a cultural icon, the namesake of an era. On the other hand, she unknowingly unleashed a genetic curse that would ripple out across Europe like bad Wi-Fi. One of her granddaughters married into the Russian royal family, another into the Spanish, others into the German houses. Before long, hemophilia was popping up in royal nurseries from St. Petersburg to Madrid. What Victoria had really done was turn Europe's family tree into a genetic game of hot potato. Except nobody wanted to be holding it when the bleeding started. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, we're still with Victoria herself, short, stubborn, perpetually mourning her beloved husband Prince Albert after his death, and blissfully unaware that her family tree was less a proud oak and more a sickly houseplant. She became known as the grandmother of Europe, because nearly every ruling family in the continent had one of her descendants in their bloodline. Unfortunately, they also had a decent chance of inheriting her defective gene. So while the British Empire was striding confidently into the modern age, laying telegraph cables under oceans and building railways across continents, the House of Windsor, then the House of Hanover, was quietly sitting on a medical disaster waiting to unfold. You could say Queen Victoria didn't just pass on the crown, she passed on the medical bills. And that, dear listener, is how we set the stage. One tiny queen, one big empire, and one even bigger problem hidden in her DNA. Let's talk about hemophilia, the uninvited guest at Queen Victoria's family reunion. In the simplest terms, hemophilia is a disorder where your blood just doesn't get the memo about clotting. For most of us, if you cut your finger slicing bread, your body plugs the leak and you move on with your day. With hemophilia, that tiny nick becomes an open-ended drama. It's not so much a cut as it is a full-time job, but here's the grim twist. In the 19th century, when Queen Victoria's children began inheriting this unlucky gene, medicine was about as helpful as a screen door on a submarine. Today, someone with hemophilia can take clotting factor concentrates and live a relatively normal life. Back then, if your blood didn't clot, the best the doctor could offer was a prayer and maybe a chair to faint in. Hemophilia wasn't just bad, it was terrifying. Imagine being told that every bruise, every scraped knee, every stubbed toe wasn't just painful but potentially fatal. Children with hemophilia could die from something as ordinary as falling off a chair, and internal bleeding was even worse. A bump to the head could turn into unstoppable brain bleeding, while bleeding into the joints left young boys crippled and in constant pain. In other words, every day was like walking around with a sword of Damocles, except the sword was your own blood deciding not to behave. And if you think the disease itself was rough, just wait until you hear about the treatments. 19th century medicine was, let's say, creative. Doctors still clung to ancient ideas about balancing the humors. You had too much blood. Obviously, the cure was to drain more blood. Imagine the horror of being a hemophiliac and having a physician nod seriously while attaching a leech to your arm. Oh, you're bleeding too much? Let's add some extra bleeding. Perfect. If you survived the treatment, it was probably out of spite, to make things worse. Anesthesia had only just arrived on the medical scene in the mid-1800s, and even then it was still considered suspicious by some doctors. Many believed patients should feel pain, as if agony was part of the healing process. Surgery without anesthesia was already like a medieval torture session, but for someone with hemophilia, going under the knife wasn't just painful, it was practically suicidal. One slip of the scalpel and the patient could bleed out before the surgeon had even tied his apron. And here's where the cruel irony of hemophilia comes in. The disease was genetically sneaky. Because of the way it's inherited, women often carried the gene without showing symptoms, while their sons ended up paying the biological bill. To the naked eye, Queen Victoria looked perfectly healthy. She lived well into her 80s, eating rich meals, scowling at her children, and posing for portraits. But hidden in her DNA was the royal curse. When her sons and grandsons were born, some of them were destined to live short lives filled with injuries they couldn't recover from. It's no wonder hemophilia became infamous as the royal disease. It didn't just strike anyone, it struck princes. The condition turned palace nurseries into medical wards, where nurses watched nervously as little boys toddled around, praying they wouldn't trip over their own feet. Every toy, every staircase, every mischievous cousin with a wooden sword was a potential threat. Childhood, which is supposed to be about running around and scraping knees, became a slow-motion obstacle course of dangers. And let's not forget the social side of things. In an era obsessed with strong heirs and the survival of dynasties, hemophilia wasn't just a private medical matter, it was a political disaster. A bleeding prince couldn't exactly lead an army into battle. A weak heir meant a weak throne. And when your dynasty is competing with every other crowned head of Europe, the last thing you want is your child confined to bed with a joint swollen like a balloon. Royals were supposed to look immortal, unshakable, and divinely blessed. Instead, hemophilia made them look fragile, and fragility doesn't mix well with politics. The medical ignorance of the time only made matters worse. Without genetic science, nobody could explain why this disease kept appearing in royal nurseries. Some blamed curses, others whispered about bad luck, and a few probably thought it was divine punishment for royals marrying their cousins a little too often. Spoiler: cousin marriage didn't cause hemophilia, but it certainly didn't help the gene stay contained once it appeared. Doctors fumbled around with remedies that sound laughable now: cold baths, strange diets, even the occasional glass of brandy for the blood. If the child survived, the treatment got the credit. If not, well, at least the doctors had tried. The real tragedy is that for families like Queen Victoria's, there was no real solution. Every birth carried a risk, every accident could be fatal, and every generation saw the curse spread further. So hemophilia wasn't just a medical problem, it was a royal nightmare, a disease that mocked medicine and defied the 19th century's optimism about progress. Steam engines were conquering distance, telegraphs were shrinking the world, but inside palace nurseries, a scraped knee could still spell doom. To sum it up, hemophilia was the genetic equivalent of a live grenade tossed into the royal cradle, and when it landed in Queen Victoria's family, it wasn't just bad luck, it was destiny, written in blood. When it came to romance, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were in many ways the ultimate 19th century power couple. She adored him so much she wrote about their wedding night in her diary with surprising enthusiasm. Historians still blush when quoting her. But behind the candlelight and violin music lurked an awkward detail. Albert was her first cousin. Yes, the man she swooned over was not only her husband but also the nephew of her mother's brother. Nothing says soulmate quite like sharing a family reunion buffet. Now, marrying cousins might sound like a plot twist from a rural soap opera, but in royal circles, it was practically standard procedure. Why? Because when you sit on a throne, you don't just marry for love, you marry for politics. Royals were obsessed with keeping crowns, castles, and armies in the family. And by in the family, they often meant literally in the family. Cousin marriages allowed monarchs to strengthen alliances without the risk of introducing any inconvenient commoner blood. In theory, this kept dynasties stable. In practice, it made the family tree less of a tree and more of a tangled bush that badly needed pruning. Europe's royal family tree wasn't growing outward, it was folding inward, like a poorly packed umbrella. Or, as one might put it, it looked less like a grand oak and more like a pair of tangled earbuds pulled from the bottom of a pocket. Victoria and Albert set the tone with their own union, and boy did they multiply. 9 children, each one shipped off across Europe like carefully wrapped parcels labelled "handle with crown." Their marriages linked the British royal house with Germany, Russia, Denmark, Spain, and practically every monarchy that had a castle and a flag. At family gatherings, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who wasn't related. Europe wasn't just a continent, it was Victoria's extended family WhatsApp group. Let's break down how messy this got. Their eldest daughter, Victoria, Vicky, married the future German Emperor Frederick III. Their daughter Alice married Louis IV of Hesse, cementing ties with yet another German state. Alfred married into the Russian imperial family. Beatrice tied the knot with Prince Henry of Battenberg, and so it went. By the end of the 19th century, Victoria's descendants were sprinkled across palaces like confetti at a royal wedding. The logic behind all this was simple: keep Europe's ruling families interlocked, and you'll reduce the chance of wars. After all, who wants to invade their in-laws? But the flaw in that plan became glaringly obvious when World War I broke out, and half of Europe's monarchs were cousins trying to bomb each other. It turns out family dinners don't always prevent family feuds. They just make them more awkward. But let's step back into Victoria's time. Cousin marriage wasn't just about politics. It was about image. Royals truly believed they were different from the rest of humanity, almost a separate species. Mixing with non-royals wasn't just frowned upon, it was treated as a scandal. Better to marry a cousin than risk marrying a duke's daughter who was, heaven forbid, only nobility. Keeping it all in the family was seen as noble. They called it purity. Today we'd probably call it short-sighted genetics. This royal habit created family gatherings of epic confusion. Imagine a Christmas dinner where everyone is both your cousin and your in-law. Who do you sit next to? How do you label the place cards? To my dearest cousin brother-in-law twice removed. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. Victoria's household practically needed flowcharts just to explain who belonged to which branch of the family. But the real consequence of all this intermarrying wasn't awkward introductions, it was genetics. While Chapter 2 showed how hemophilia entered the royal bloodstream, cousin marriages generally increased the chance of any inherited traits, good or bad, sticking around. Europe's monarchies became petri dishes for whatever quirks, flaws, or mutations happened to show up. If one person had a funny chin, give it 2 generations and everyone at the royal portrait sitting would have the same chin. It also explains why so many European royals of the 19th and early 20th century looked like they'd been photocopied. The Habsburgs, for instance, had already suffered centuries of cousin marriages that produced the infamous Habsburg jaw, a chin so prominent it deserved its own postcode. Victoria's family didn't go quite that far, but let's just say their matchmaking choices weren't doing the gene pool any favors. Of course, at the time, no one thought of it this way. To them, cousin marriage was tradition, a duty, even an act of patriotism. To us, it looks more like they were running a human genetics experiment without consent forms. By the time Victoria's grandchildren were marrying each other's cousins, Europe's royal family tree had looped back on itself so many times it could have qualified as a Mobius strip. And so, while Victoria and Albert may have thought they were securing peace and stability through their carefully arranged unions, what they actually created was a genealogical pretzel. By 1900, if you picked a random European prince or princess, chances were good they could trace their lineage back to Queen Victoria within 2 or 3 generations. Europe didn't just share borders, it shared grandparents. In short, Victoria and Albert's marriage set off a domino effect of cousin unions that tied Europe's monarchies together so tightly that they could hardly breathe. To the outside world, it looked like diplomacy at its finest. To the family doctors, it looked like future business opportunities, because when you fold the gene pool into itself enough times, you're not breeding heirs, you're breeding medical charts. Europe's royal family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a knotted, looping, confusing mess. Less majestic oak and more tangled earbuds you gave up trying to untangle, and tangled earbuds, as we'll see, make for one very messy soundtrack when history presses play. For most royal sons in history, childhood was a mix of lessons, tutors, and the occasional ceremonial parade where they waved at crowds while trying not to drop their hats. For Queen Victoria's sons, however, even playtime came with a dangerous twist. A scrape or bruise could turn into a death sentence. It was less childhood and more walking around with a permanent warning label. The most famous of Victoria's afflicted sons was Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany. Born in 1853, Leopold was a bright, curious boy who quickly became known for his intelligence, charm, and artistic flair. Unfortunately, he also inherited hemophilia, a fact that turned his life into a constant balancing act between ambition and fragility. Imagine being a young prince with all the energy and curiosity in the world, but living in a body that treated every bump like a catastrophic accident. In a world where Lego bricks could be fatal, Leopold didn't stand a chance. Hemophilia left Leopold constantly under watch. His nurses, tutors, and family members hovered around him like nervous hawks, terrified that he might trip over a step or bump into furniture. Childhood games had to be carefully modified. No roughhousing, no wrestling, no climbing trees. If other children were knights charging into battle with wooden swords, Leopold was the boy in the corner playing chess and hoping the pieces weren't sharp. Despite his limitations, Leopold refused to be defined by his illness. He was intellectually gifted, with a passion for literature, music, and the arts. He attended Oxford, where he became known as a keen thinker and patron of culture. In a different life, he might have been remembered as one of Britain's great Renaissance princes, but hemophilia was the shadow that followed him everywhere, ready to strike at the worst possible moment. The cruel thing about hemophilia is that the smallest injuries become magnified. A bruise that would fade in a healthy child could swell and cripple Leopold for weeks. A tumble on the stairs could mean weeks of agony, and because internal bleeding often happened in the joints, Leopold lived with chronic pain, particularly in his knees. Imagine trying to maintain royal dignity while your body kept sabotaging you from the inside out. Every step was a gamble, every day a risk. Leopold wasn't the only son to deal with health issues, but his condition was the most severe. His older brothers Albert Edward, the future Edward VII, Alfred, and Arthur did not inherit hemophilia. They were free to chase military careers, hunt, and indulge in the kind of activities royal sons were supposed to. But Leopold was different, and his difference shaped not only his personal life, but also Victoria's attitude toward him. The Queen, who could be both fiercely protective and deeply controlling, often fretted over Leopold's health. She feared losing him the way she had lost her beloved husband Albert years earlier. To her, Leopold was simultaneously precious and fragile, like an heirloom porcelain vase that everyone admired but no one dared touch. Her letters reveal her constant worry about his well-being, as if she expected bad news at any moment. And to be fair, with hemophilia, bad news was always lurking just around the corner. Yet Leopold pushed back against this cocoon of caution. He wanted to live, to marry, to have children, to take part in the world like his brothers. He wasn't content to remain in a padded nursery surrounded by anxious nurses. Against his mother's initial objections, he married Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont in 8. Their marriage was short, but by all accounts happy, producing 2 children before tragedy struck. In 1884, at just 30 years old, Leopold suffered a fall in Cannes, France. He slipped, injured his knee, and the resulting hemorrhage proved fatal. What might have been a minor accident for anyone else became the end of his story. A young, brilliant prince, snuffed out by the cruel mathematics of genetics. His mother was devastated, describing his death as the greatest sorrow since Albert's death. Hemophilia had claimed one of her most beloved children. Leopold's story highlights the brutal reality of life with hemophilia in the 19th century. Medicine offered little more than sympathy and guesswork. No clotting factor treatments, no transfusions, no real hope of prevention. A person's fate depended on avoiding injuries, which, let's face it, is about as practical as trying to avoid bad weather in England. The tragedy of Leopold also underscored something else: the vulnerability of monarchies that prided themselves on strength and continuity. Here was a royal prince, brilliant and capable, whose life was cut short not by war or scandal, but by an invisible flaw in his blood. It was a reminder that crowns and titles couldn't shield anyone from the whims of biology. And yet, Leopold lived his short life with remarkable resilience. He achieved more in 3 decades than many healthy royals managed in twice the time. His legacy was a bittersweet one, a reminder of what might have been had he been born without the genetic curse that shadowed his family. For Queen Victoria, losing Leopold was more than a personal tragedy. It was a grim warning of what hemophilia could do to her dynasty. If one son could be lost so suddenly, what might happen to her grandsons scattered across Europe? The curse wasn't just lingering in the background anymore. It was striking at the heart of her own household. Leopold's life was proof that royalty didn't guarantee safety. For him, the crown was never heavy on his head, but the weight of his blood was. If Queen Victoria's family tree was a medical disaster, then her daughters were the ones mailing the invitations to Europe's royal houses. You'd think the job of a Victorian princess would be to look pretty in a crown, wave gracefully at banquets, and avoid scandal. But for Victoria's daughters, their unofficial side hustle was smuggling the hemophilia gene across borders like it was contraband. Forget hereditary titles, this was hereditary trouble. Let's start with Princess Alice, Victoria's second daughter. Alice was by all accounts intelligent, compassionate, and determined to do her duty. She married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, and packed her trunks with ball gowns, jewelry, and oh yes, the hemophilia gene. Once in Germany, Alice set up shop as one of the most charitable royals of her time, nursing the poor and even caring for soldiers herself during wartime. Admirable, absolutely, but while she was out trying to heal the sick, her own children were carrying around a genetic condition that 19th century doctors couldn't do a thing about. Alice's son Friedrich Fritti inherited hemophilia and tragically died at the age of 2 after a fall from a window caused internal bleeding. It was the kind of heartbreaking event that underscored how merciless this condition was. One stumble and the royal nursery turned into a funeral, but Alice's daughters carried something just as dangerous. They became the couriers of hemophilia into other powerful dynasties. One of Alice's daughters, Alix of Hesse, made what seemed at the time like a dazzling match. She married none other than Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, making her Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna. To Russia's delight, this marriage united Britain and Russia. To Russia's dismay, it also united them with hemophilia. The imperial heir Tsarevich Alexei inherited the condition, and suddenly the entire Russian Empire was at the mercy of one boy's health. Alexei's illness would bring in the mystical Rasputin, the beardy, scandal-prone holy man who claimed to heal him, destabilize the monarchy, and contribute to the collapse of the Romanov dynasty. You could say hemophilia didn't just ruin family dinners, it helped topple empires. Thanks, Alice. Now let's switch to Princess Beatrice, Victoria's youngest daughter, who was often treated like Victoria's emotional support child. Beatrice was the baby of the family, stuck in the awkward position of being her mother's favorite, yet still expected to marry strategically. When she did marry into the Spanish royal family, she carried the gene with her like an uninvited wedding guest. Her children, including Prince Leopold of Battenberg, also inherited hemophilia. Suddenly, Spain too had a medical crisis in its royal nursery. Imagine your family reunions involving not only multiple monarchs, but also multiple doctors nervously checking blood flow. The result of all this royal matchmaking, by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, hemophilia wasn't confined to Britain. It had turned into a Europe-wide epidemic of noble proportions, traveling by marriage contracts faster than any plague. Historians have even called it the royal disease, because let's be honest, no other group of people could spread a single genetic flaw across half a continent just by exchanging vows at candlelit ceremonies. If you look at the pattern, it really was a genetic version of hot potato. Victoria passed it to her daughters passed it to their children, and their children passed it to entire dynasties. Except unlike the playground game, the potato here exploded in your hands. Each new marriage created fresh possibilities for the gene to show up in unexpected places, like a nasty plot twist in Europe's aristocratic soap opera. And what makes this truly absurd is that nobody in the 19th century understood genetics well enough to spot the problem. The science of heredity was still in its infancy. Gregor Mendel had been tinkering with pea plants in his monastery garden, but no one thought to connect those findings to princesses in silk gowns. So while peas were busy teaching science, royals were busy teaching us what not to do with a gene pool. Victoria herself may never have fully grasped the scale of the problem. To her, marriage alliances were tools of diplomacy. She saw her daughters' weddings as strings connecting her to powerful thrones across Europe. What she didn't realize was that she was also weaving a web of medical chaos, where her descendants' lives would be dictated by fragile veins and uncontrollable bleeding. So when we talk about Queen Victoria as the grandmother of Europe, it's not just because her descendants filled every palace from Madrid to Moscow, it's because her daughters unintentionally turned hemophilia into a multinational franchise. If McDonald's had golden arches, Victoria's daughters had blood clots, except theirs didn't form properly. The irony is painful and a little funny. These marriages were meant to strengthen royal houses, but they weakened them instead. Alliances were supposed to bring stability, yet what they brought was whispered worries about fragile princes, imperial heirs who couldn't ride a horse without a medical team on standby, and entire dynasties depending on how long a child could survive with a scraped knee. The joke practically writes itself. Thanks to Victoria's daughters, hemophilia had more passport stamps than a 19th century diplomat. By the late 19th century, Queen Victoria's genetic gift basket had made its way across Europe like an unwanted fruitcake. Nobody asked for it, but everyone kept ending up with a slice. And nowhere did this genetic inheritance wreak more havoc than in Russia. Enter Princess Alex of Hesse, Queen Victoria's granddaughter, who would eventually become better known as Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorovna, wife of Tsar Nicholas II. At first glance, Alex seemed like the perfect royal match, devout, intelligent, and very fond of Nicholas, which was not always the case in arranged royal marriages. But there was one little complication packed into her DNA like a ticking time bomb. She was a carrier of hemophilia. And when you're about to provide heirs to a 300-year-old autocracy built on the fragile foundations of divine right and a lot of vodka, that's not the gene you want in the mix. In 1904, after 4 daughters, Nicholas and Alexandra finally got their long-awaited son, Alexei. The Russian people celebrated as though the Romanov dynasty had just hit the jackpot. Unfortunately, it was less jackpot and more booby prize. Within months, it became clear that Alexei wasn't just another healthy imperial baby. He had hemophilia, meaning even a minor fall could result in life-threatening internal bleeding. For a boy raised in palaces with marble floors and sprawling staircases, this was like living inside a death trap. Every stumble, bruise, or scraped knee could mean days of agony, uncontrolled bleeding, and frantic physicians hovering around whispering useless advice. In an age where aspirin was considered cutting-edge medicine, and ironically worsened bleeding, Alexei's condition was catastrophic. The Romanovs were desperate. Imagine the pressure. The entire stability of the Russian Empire hinged on a child whose blood refused to cooperate. Nicholas and Alexandra had to keep Alexei's illness secret from most of the public, fearing that news of a weak heir would destabilize an already shaky monarchy. After all, it's hard to claim your dynasty is ordained by God when your future Tsar is sidelined by a bruise. So Alexandra, already deeply religious and prone to mysticism, turned to prayer. But when prayer didn't seem to work, she went looking for alternative solutions. Grigory Rasputin was not your average spiritual advisor. He was a Siberian peasant-turned-mystic with a beard that looked like it had devoured a small woodland creature, a smell that could clear a room, and eyes that supposedly mesmerized anyone who gazed into them for too long. In short, the kind of man you don't invite to Christmas dinner but who somehow never leaves. When Rasputin first appeared in the royal orbit around 1905, he claimed he could heal the boy where trained doctors had failed. The problem? He was not a doctor, he was more of a self-styled holy man with a questionable track record and an even more questionable personal life. But desperate parents don't quibble over resumes when their only son is at death's door. And here's the strange part. It worked, or at least it seemed to. On multiple occasions when Alexei was gravely ill, Rasputin would appear, mutter prayers, lay hands on him, and miracle of miracles, the boy improved. Historians still debate how. One theory is that Rasputin, unlike the doctors, told Alexandra to stop giving Alexei aspirin, which worsened his bleeding. Whether it was mystical healing or sheer luck, Rasputin became indispensable. Pretty soon, Rasputin wasn't just advising on Alexei's health. He was advising on politics, appointments, and even foreign policy. He had the ear of Alexandra, who believed he was God's instrument to protect her son. This caused endless rumors and resentment in Russian society. Ministers loathed him, nobles sneered at him, and the Russian people whispered about the strange, smelly man with unkempt hair, who seemed to have the empress wrapped around his finger. It didn't help that Rasputin was also famous for his extracurricular activities. His reputation for excessive drinking and womanizing was the stuff of legend, Imagine your country's royal family relying on a man who made Charlie Sheen look like a monk. That was Russia in the early 20th century. The more Alexandra defended Rasputin, the more people distrusted the monarchy. By the time World War I rolled around, Rasputin's influence had become a national scandal, with Nicholas at the front trying to prove his military leadership. Spoiler, he couldn't. Alexandra and Rasputin were left running the show at home. Ministers were hired and fired at Rasputin's whim. Policies turned chaotic, and rumors of Rasputin and Alexandra's close relationship, probably exaggerated but juicy nonetheless, ran wild. All because of one genetic quirk passed down from Queen Victoria. The irony is staggering. A British queen's bloodline problem had now become a Russian imperial catastrophe. Alexei's hemophilia didn't just weaken his body, it weakened the entire Romanov dynasty. By the time revolution swept through Russia in 1917, public hatred for the Romanovs was fueled not just by war, famine, and inequality, but also by the perception that their monarchy was in the thrall of a mad mystic. Rasputin's shadow loomed large over the downfall of the Romanovs, and it all traced back to Queen Victoria's genes quietly hitching a ride into the Russian imperial family. To put it bluntly, one bad gene and one weird wizard later, the world's largest empire went from imperial balls to Bolshevik barricades. One bad gene later, and suddenly Russia's hiring a wizard with questionable hygiene to do the family health care. If there's one thing European royalty excelled at, aside from fancy hats and starting wars they couldn't finish, it was turning family life into something that looked suspiciously like a daytime soap opera. And in Spain, thanks to Queen Victoria's descendants, the drama wasn't confined to court intrigues or palace scandals. No, Spain's royal family managed to make their bloodlines headline news. Quite literally, since the issue at hand was that their blood wouldn't clot. Let's set the scene. Spain in the late 19th and early 20th centuries wasn't exactly the most stable place. The monarchy was wobbly, the people were restless, and the political landscape had more cracks than a porcelain tea set after a toddler's tea party. What Spain really didn't need was another complication. Unfortunately, Queen Victoria's granddaughter, Princess Beatrice, had other ideas. She dutifully passed along hemophilia to her children like it was a particularly unfortunate family heirloom, and the Spanish royals were stuck with it. Enter Prince Alfonso, the crown jewel in this blood-soaked inheritance. Alfonso wasn't just a royal child, he was a ticking medical liability in breeches. Born into a dynasty already known for inbreeding because apparently cousin was the hottest title at European royal mixers, Alfonso inherited both the throne and a condition that made a stubbed toe a matter of state concern. Now, in most households, keeping a child safe meant telling them not to climb too high on the furniture. In Alfonso's case, the entire Spanish court became an elaborate bubble wrap operation. Running? Too dangerous. Swordplay? Absolutely not. Horse riding? Only if everyone around him was prepared to dive like Secret Service agents at the first sign of a scrape. Imagine growing up surrounded by knights, courtiers and nannies, all staring at you like you were a porcelain doll about to tip over. Not exactly the carefree childhood storybooks promised. But fate, as it often does in royal families, decided to twist the knife. Despite the careful watch of palace staff, Alfonso met an early end. Accounts vary on whether it was a car accident or a seemingly minor injury. But the result was the same. A tragic death at just 31 years old, cut short because his blood couldn't do its job. The Spanish throne had lost yet another heir, and all because hemophilia had hitched a ride on Victoria's sprawling family tree. And here's the kicker. Hemophilia wasn't Spain's only problem. The royals also had a long-standing obsession with cousin marriages that made family gatherings both convenient and awkward. The logic seemed to be, why invite strangers to the palace when you can just marry the people already sitting at the dinner table? The result was a gene pool so shallow you could wade through it without getting your ankles wet. Hemophilia simply dove in and made itself comfortable. The Spanish monarchy's medical misfortunes didn't go unnoticed. European gossip circles, which at this point were basically 19th century versions of tabloid magazines, whispered endlessly about the royal curse. Other monarchies looked on with a mix of sympathy and smug relief, secretly glad it wasn't their bloodlines facing constant peril. To make matters worse, Spain's political situation was crumbling. Every time a royal hemophiliac had an accident, the people questioned not only the monarchy's ability to rule, but also their very right to continue existing. A king who couldn't survive a paper cut didn't exactly inspire national confidence. And if this all sounds like a Shakespearean tragedy, just wait, it gets more dramatic. The hemophilia issue in Spain wasn't just medical, it was political dynamite. Each time an heir died young, the succession crisis grew thornier. Who would take over? Could the monarchy survive without a stable line of heirs? The palace's greatest enemy wasn't always rebels or anarchists. It was the microscopic chaos hidden in their veins. Meanwhile, the doctors of the time, armed with their trusty but ineffective bag of tricks, were as helpful as a fire extinguisher made of kerosene. Spain's royal physicians had few remedies to offer beyond rest, prayer, and wildly misguided medical interventions. Blood transfusions were just emerging, but they carried enormous risks, and more often than not, they were too little too late. What Spain really needed was modern medicine. What it got was endless funerals and a monarchy that seemed increasingly fragile with each generation. Hemophilia's shadow over Spain became symbolic of the monarchy's decline. By the early 20th century, the Spanish people had little patience left for rulers who spent more time managing their medical charts than governing. Alfonso's tragic fate became one of many reminders that this royal family was out of touch, outdated, and doomed by biology as much as politics. So, if Russia had Rasputin and his bizarre healing powers, Spain had something much more mundane but equally tragic. A monarchy, constantly derailed by nosebleeds, bruises, and the consequences of centuries of cousin weddings. It wasn't sorcery or conspiracy. It was simply the result of genetics gone unchecked. A real-life soap opera where every season ended in another funeral. The joke practically writes itself. By this point, Spain's royal doctor didn't need a stethoscope, he needed a mop, and maybe a resignation letter. If Queen Victoria's descendants had been a product, the label would have read, "Warning, may contain traces of hemophilia, do not mix with monarchy." And unfortunately for Germany, they bought the whole set in bulk. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Victoria's daughters had married into German dynasties, carting along that infamous royal curse. The result? German politics were already a minefield of egos, alliances, and saber-rattling. Now add in a genetic disorder where the tiniest cut could spell disaster. It was less a royal family tree and more a family Jenga tower, wobbling dangerously while everyone pretended it was perfectly stable. Let's back up. Victoria's second daughter, Princess Alice, had married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse. Their brood was a charming export line of both elegance and hemophilia. Alice's daughters, Victoria, Elizabeth, and Alex, were snapped up by Europe's marriage market like limited edition dolls. Alex, of course, went on to Russia and chaos, but her sisters carried the gene around Germany like it was a particularly fragile hand-me-down sweater. It didn't help that German royals already adored marrying each other, which meant the gene didn't just visit, it set up permanent residence. Now, if you were a German royal at this time, you already had enough on your plate. You were living in a country that had only recently stitched itself together out of dozens of squabbling states. You had an emperor, Wilhelm II, whose idea of diplomacy was usually, say something insulting, then storm off in a huff. Industrial strikes, political factions, and rising socialism were brewing in the background like an overfilled pressure cooker. In short, Germany was gearing up for the 20th century with all the stability of a wobbly bar stool, and into this, the British hemophilia gene politely knocked and said, "Mind if I make things worse?" To understand why this mattered, imagine the problem from a royal perspective. Monarchies are built on appearances. The gleam of military parades, the glamour of weddings, the pomp of coronations. Nothing says we are strong, eternal, and divinely appointed to rule, quite like tripping on your own blood supply because your body won't stop bleeding. For German royals, a single accident, a fall from a horse, a rough game of fencing practice, couldn't just ruin the afternoon. It could destabilize succession, alliances, and public confidence. One notorious case was Friedrich of Hesse, Alice's grandson. He inherited hemophilia and tragically died as a young child after a seemingly minor fall from a window. It was a brutal reminder that for this branch of the family, danger lurked in the most ordinary mishaps. The streets of Berlin and Darmstadt may have been buzzing with new electric lights and booming factories, but inside the royal nurseries, every stumble was a potential obituary, and the German medical establishment, let's just say it wasn't exactly up to the challenge. By the late 19th century, doctors were making progress, antiseptics, anesthesia, some understanding of germ theory, but hemophilia remained a medical riddle. Treatments ranged from rest and pressure, which occasionally helped, to bizarre experimental concoctions that did absolutely nothing. Transfusions were possible, but risky and primitive. Essentially, if you had hemophilia in Germany at this time, you were depending less on doctors and more on luck, or as the royals must have thought of it, divine providence mixed with frantic prayers. The political consequences were just as dire. A monarchy relies on heirs. The line of succession is supposed to march forward like a military parade, tidy, organized, unbroken. Hemophilia threw banana peels all over that parade route. Every time a child was born, the court whispered, "Will this one be normal, or will a scrape mean tragedy?" The uncertainty bred paranoia, and paranoia breeds terrible political decisions. German royals began to hedge bets, marrying even closer within their extended family to secure dynastic ties, which of course only invited more of the very gene they were trying to avoid. It was like setting your house on fire to keep warm. Meanwhile, Wilhelm II, Victoria's own grandson, wasn't personally affected by hemophilia, but the perception of frailty among his cousins and kin cast a long shadow. Wilhelm was obsessed with projecting strength, naval fleets, military uniforms, aggressive speeches. Yet behind him stood a family tree riddled with medical fragility, as though the very core of royal legitimacy was rotting from within. For a man trying to prove that Germany belonged at the head table of Europe, his dynasty's quiet medical weakness was a humiliating liability. So by the early 20th century, Germany found itself with a dangerous cocktail: political instability, a hot-headed emperor, rising international tensions, and a royal family whose bloodline was literally defective. If you were writing a recipe for disaster, this was the part where you added an extra pinch of chaos for flavor. And sure enough, the coming decades would prove that Germany needed very little nudging to tumble headlong into catastrophe. Victoria's genetic legacy may not have caused World War I, but it certainly didn't make Germany any sturdier on its march toward it. The joke of it all? The German royals were already sprinting toward historical disaster, militarism, nationalism, diplomatic blunders. Hemophilia just greased the tracks, ensuring that when they stumbled, they wouldn't be getting back up easily. To understand why hemophilia spread like gossip in a Victorian ballroom, you need to picture Europe's royals making marriage decisions with the same level of genetic insight as a goldfish. Today, we know about DNA, recessive genes, and why marrying your cousin is a very bad idea if you want children who don't collapse at the sight of a paper cut. But in the 19th century, the reigning philosophy was, if they're royal, they're eligible. Genetics wasn't even in the dictionary. Literally, Gregor Mendel, the now famous monk who spent the 1850s and 1860s crossbreeding peas like a horticultural matchmaker, had already figured out the basic laws of inheritance. He meticulously charted how traits passed from one generation to the next, scribbling down ratios like 3 tall plants to 1 short plant in a monastery garden. It was the foundation of modern genetics, but nobody cared. His paper sat gathering dust in obscure journals, while royals across Europe were enthusiastically reenacting a family reunion buffet line. Why was Mendel ignored? Partly because his work was about peas, and no one thought peas could possibly apply to humans, let alone to glamorous monarchs who wore diamonds at breakfast. Also, Mendel was a monk in Brno, which was not exactly the scientific hotspot of Europe. Darwin was publishing on the origin of species at the same time, and everyone was too busy arguing whether we came from monkeys to pay attention to the monk muttering, "Actually, your cousin marriage is going to come back and bite you in the bloodstream." The royal mindset didn't help. To them, cousin marriages weren't dangerous, they were safe, politically safe. Marrying within the family kept alliances tight, prevented pesky wars, and ensured that land, titles, and castles stayed neatly on the family ledger. The fact that it also made their gene pool look like the kiddie section of a hotel swimming pool was overlooked. After all, you can't see DNA, but you can see a shiny crown. Guess which one mattered more at the engagement party? Imagine trying to warn Queen Victoria, Mendel, "Your Majesty, if you marry your cousin, there's a 1 in 4 chance your children will inherit dangerous recessive traits." Victoria, "What's a recessive trait?" Mendel, "Something deadly that you can't see at first." Victoria, "Ah, sounds like Parliament. Carry on." So while science was buried in the monastery archives, European courts kept drawing up marriage contracts between first cousins like it was the royal version of Tinder. Swipe right on the Habsburg jawline, swipe right on your uncle's son, swipe right again because, oh wait, that's also your cousin. The irony is that the Victorians were obsessed with health and good breeding. They wrote long essays about race, heredity, and the importance of not mixing with inferior stock, and yet their idea of good breeding was literally inbreeding. It's the genetic equivalent of writing a book on nutrition while eating nothing but boiled sugar. By the time science caught up, it was too late. Mendel's work wasn't rediscovered until 1900, decades after Victoria's children and grandchildren had already spread hemophilia like confetti at a wedding. It was as if Europe's most powerful families had all agreed to play a centuries-long game of guess who, but no one realized the answer was always hemophiliac. Doctors weren't much help either. They had no concept of genetics. If you asked a 19th century doctor why a boy was bleeding uncontrollably, he might answer with something vague like, "His humors are unbalanced," or "He has thin blood," or "Clearly he needs more leeches." Imagine being a mother watching your child bleed to death, and the doctor's solution is, "Let's take out more blood to make him stronger." That's not medicine, that's medieval stand-up comedy with tragic consequences. The true kicker is how preventable it all could have been. If anyone had paid attention to Mendel's P's, they might have realized that marrying the person you share half your grandparents with is not a recipe for healthy children. But because nobody read the fine print of biology, royal bloodlines got the genetic equivalent of a spam email virus. So here's the punchline. While Mendel was yelling at his peas for not sprouting the right way, Europe's royals were yelling at their doctors for not stopping the bleeding. Science had the answers. Nobody was listening. And the result was a continent full of rulers who looked powerful on the outside, but were genetically one Lego brick away from a medical emergency. In short, Mendel had the math, Victoria had the bloodline, and together they wrote the most tragic comedy of errors in royal history. If Queen Victoria's family tree came with a user manual, it would read less like instructions for assembling furniture and more like side effects of a poorly tested medication, may cause bruising, excessive bleeding, or the downfall of several monarchies. Consult your doctor, or in the case of the Russian royals, a bearded mystic who bathes less often than a cat. Victoria never set out to become the great distributor of Europe's most infamous genetic glitch. In fact, she probably considered herself wildly successful. She married off her 9 children into every royal house with a pulse and a crown. She had daughters in Germany, Russia, and Spain, sons tying alliances with Denmark and beyond, and grandchildren practically everywhere else. At family reunions, you couldn't throw a scone without hitting someone who could lay claim to a throne. On paper, this was genius diplomacy. In practice, it was a recipe for medical disaster. Hemophilia, the royal disease, quietly hitched a ride in Victoria's DNA and then went on the European tour of the century. Wherever her daughters went, the gene went with them. Like a particularly unwelcome wedding gift. Germany got it, Spain got it, Russia got it, and that one ended with a mystic farmer running state policy. If there were frequent traveler miles for recessive genetic disorders, hemophilia would have been in first class. The problem wasn't just medical. In the 19th century, monarchies were already fragile institutions. Liberal revolutions, industrial upheavals, and restless citizens were rattling the foundations of Europe's thrones. The last thing any royal family needed was a genetic time bomb that made heirs so fragile they couldn't survive a nosebleed. But Victoria's brood delivered exactly that. Suddenly, royal succession became less about political intrigue and more about whether an heir could survive falling off a horse, tripping on a stair, or brushing up against a sharp corner of furniture. Take Russia, for example. Tsarevich Alexei's condition made his parents desperate, vulnerable, and dependent on Rasputin, a man who looked like he'd lost a fight with soap. In Spain, young Prince Alfonso's death left the monarchy with fewer heirs and more instability. In Germany, whispers of weak royal blood added fuel to political critics already sharpening their republican knives. The gene wasn't just bleeding into bodies, it was bleeding into politics, accelerating the decline of dynasties that had ruled for centuries. The irony is delicious. For centuries, royal families married their cousins to keep bloodlines pure, as if aristocratic DNA needed to be protected from peasants like fine china. But Victoria's family demonstrated the opposite. Pure bloodlines weren't pure at all. They were landmines waiting to explode. Instead of ensuring stability, these marriages concentrated genetic risks until the most powerful families in Europe looked less like dynasties and more like medical case studies. And the kicker, science had the answers, just not in the right place or time. While Gregor Mendel was quietly charting pea plants and demonstrating inheritance, his work went ignored, stuffed away in monastic journals. Meanwhile, Victoria's descendants were proving Mendel's theories the hard way, one tragic heir at a time. The royals didn't understand X-linked inheritance, but history didn't care. The gene spread anyway, reshaping empires. So what are we left with? A legacy where Victoria, grandmother of Europe, not only filled palaces with her descendants but also turned them into unwitting carriers of a disease that changed history. Instead of uniting Europe with peace treaties, diplomacy or trade, she united Europe with hemophilia. It's almost poetic if your idea of poetry involves emergency doctors and political collapse. In hindsight, Victoria's family tree isn't really a tree at all. It's a cautionary tale, a warning label that should hang in every genetics classroom and every royal nursery. This is what happens when you treat marriage like a board game of Risk and ignore biology entirely. The grand lesson is clear. Power may protect you from angry mobs, revolutions, or even bankruptcy, but it can't protect you from your DNA. The good news? Modern medicine has treatments for hemophilia, and royal families today are less obsessed with cousin marriage as foreign policy. The bad news? Victoria's legacy is immortalized not only in statues and portraits but in textbooks under hemophilia, royal disease. History has a cruel sense of humor. So was Queen Victoria successful? In a way, yes. She connected Europe like no monarch before her. But the connection wasn't strength, stability, or prosperity. It was fragility. Her family tree was less an oak of majesty and more a tangled vine of medical misfortune. And once it spread across borders, it reshaped dynasties and, in some cases, helped tip the balance toward revolution. Victoria's real epitaph could read, "She conquered Europe's thrones, then she accidentally weakened them with her DNA." Or, to put it more bluntly, Victoria united Europe all right, just not with peace treaties, with blood disorders. If you were alive in the late 1800s, the world already seemed like a science fiction novel that couldn't stop showing off. Electricity was starting to light up city streets, telegraph wires wrapped around continents like metal vines. Trains were puffing along faster than ever, and then some bright German physicist named Heinrich Hertz decided that the invisible forces in the air weren't quite spooky enough yet. So he went ahead and proved the existence of electromagnetic waves. Now, in plain English, Hertz showed that energy could travel invisibly through space without wires, like some kind of ghostly courier service. He wasn't trying to invent Spotify or your morning talk show. He was just doing experiments to confirm the theories of James Clerk Maxwell the Scottish genius who had mathematically predicted that these waves existed. Hertz's test setup was simple, but world-changing. He created sparks in one coil of wire, and they jumped to another coil across the room. No connection in between. For the first time in human history, a signal had traveled through the air. It was like sending a secret handshake across empty space. Of course, the first reaction wasn't amazing, this will change communication forever. No, the first reaction was more along the lines of cool trick, but can it toast bread? Even Hertz himself didn't see the practical use. He supposedly said, "It's of no use whatsoever. This is just an experiment that proves Maestro Maxwell was right." Translation: neat, but don't expect me to turn this into a business. Hertz might have been brilliant, but he had all the marketing instincts of a damp sponge. Enter Guglielmo Marconi, the young Italian with both curiosity and entrepreneurial guts. Unlike Hertz, Marconi took one look at invisible waves jumping through the air and thought, "Oh, this is going to make me rich." He was the guy who saw invisible waves and immediately imagined sending messages across mountains, across oceans, across anywhere. At the time, long-distance communication required endless wires strung up like spiderwebs across the globe. Marconi's big idea was, what if we could just not? By 1895, Marconi was out in his parents' garden in Bologna, setting up a contraption of wires, spark gaps and metal rods, trying to make a signal travel farther and farther. One day he managed to ring a bell a mile away without any physical connection. To his neighbors, it probably looked like witchcraft. To Marconi, it was proof that he was onto something that could transform the world. To his mother, it was probably proof that her son was going to blow up the backyard. But the real showstopper came when Marconi sent signals across long distances and eventually across the Atlantic Ocean in 1901. Imagine the drama. Skeptics said Earth's curvature would block the waves. Marconi just shrugged, built a transmitter in Cornwall, England, and aimed it at Newfoundland, Canada. When faint Morse code dots and dashes arrived on the other side, history was made. Humanity had officially invented wireless long-distance communication. Of course, people didn't know what to make of it. Some thought it was sorcery. Others thought it was dangerous. There were even newspaper editorials warning that invisible radio waves might damage people's health, because apparently humans will always panic about invisible things, whether it's radio waves in 1901 or 5G towers in 2020. Still, the practical applications were too good to ignore. Suddenly, ships at sea could communicate with land without a single wire, armies could coordinate beyond shouting distance, and inventors began to imagine a future where sound, not just Morse code, might one day ride those same invisible waves. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. In the 1890s, radio wasn't yet entertainment. It wasn't music. It wasn't news. It was mostly static, sparks, and the occasional Morse code message. And yet, even that static was exciting because it proved the concept worked. If you've ever been excited when your Wi-Fi finally connects after a long outage, imagine that joy multiplied by 1,000, and add some static shocks for extra flavor. Now here's the funny part. Explaining this to your average person back then was nearly impossible. So you're telling me there are invisible waves in the air carrying signals I can't see, smell, or touch? Yes. And you're saying these waves are bouncing around the world carrying dots and dashes? Correct. And you expect me to believe that, instead of just assuming you're possessed? Well, yes. For many people, Marconi's radio might as well have been a séance machine. Grandma wasn't tuning into the evening broadcast. She was crossing herself and wondering whether demons had moved into the parlor. Marconi, however, didn't care. He started building a business empire out of this invisible magic. His company sold wireless equipment to governments and shipping lines, and before long, radio was no longer a laboratory curiosity. It was an industry, and that industry would grow into something nobody at the time could have predicted. News broadcasts, music stations, soap operas, presidential speeches, wartime propaganda, teenage rebellion, and yes, even that DJ who insists on talking over your favorite song. But in the beginning, it was just Hertz with his sparks, and Marconi with his ambition. turning invisible waves into something tangible. The spark that started it all was literally a spark, and from it, the entire history of radio unfolded. So, the next time your Bluetooth headphones cut out for the 5th time in a row, take a moment to thank these pioneers. Without them, you wouldn't just be frustrated with static, you'd be frustrated with absolutely nothing at all. Before radio gave us smooth jazz, morning DJs and late-night conspiracy shows about aliens, it gave us dots and dashes. Not exactly binge-worthy entertainment, but in the early 1900s this was the cutting edge. Imagine a world where streaming meant you were desperately hoping your Morse code message didn't drown in static halfway across the ocean. The star of this chapter is wireless telegraphy, basically the telegraph but without the wires. On land, the telegraph had already shrunk the world by the mid-1800s. Messages that once took weeks by horse and carriage could travel across continents in minutes, thanks to those endless cables strung on poles. But there was one big, soggy problem: oceans. You could run wires across land, but not easily across thousands of miles of deep, salty water. Undersea cables existed, but they were expensive, fragile, and prone to breaking. Ships at sea were basically communication dead zones, until radio came along with its beeps and boops. Morse code, invented in the 1830s by Samuel Morse, a painter turned inventor because apparently oil brushes and electromagnets are closer cousins than you'd think, was perfect for the job. It reduced every letter of the alphabet into a pattern of short and long signals, dots and dashes that could be sent as bursts of sound or light. A was a dot and a dash, E was a dash and 3 dots. Entire novels could be boiled down into beeps, though by the time you tapped out Pride and Prejudice, your finger would be broken and your audience long dead from boredom. When radio waves came along, Morse code hopped onto them like a hitchhiker who had finally found a car. Suddenly, ships at sea could send and receive messages without a single wire attached. This was revolutionary. Captains could warn each other about icebergs, report positions, or just complain about the food, though, honestly, who was on the other end to care? Governments jumped on it too, realizing they could finally send instructions to distant naval fleets without resorting to flag-waving, carrier pigeons, or screaming really loudly across the waves. But let's talk about the Titanic, because nothing sells the importance of a technology like a giant, tragic disaster. On April 14, 1912, when the Titanic struck that infamous iceberg, the ship's Marconi wireless operators, yes, Marconi had already turned his invention into a lucrative business, began tapping out SOS signals into the night. Those 3 letters, ... became iconic. Other ships picked up the distress call and rushed to the scene. While more than 1,500 lives were lost, hundreds were saved because of those beeps traveling invisibly across the Atlantic. Shanlitheland, a note that cemented wireless telegraphy as not just useful, but absolutely essential. Afterward, maritime laws required passenger ships to maintain constant radio watches. Translation: if you were on a boat after 1912, someone was always on duty listening to the static, waiting for trouble, and probably also falling asleep, because hours of dots and dashes can lull even the most caffeinated operator into a coma. It wasn't just emergencies, though. Morse code soon became a global lifeline for everyday communication. During wars, wireless operators tapped out coded orders, reports, and, in some cases, deliberately misleading messages to trick the enemy. One might argue that Morse code was the first form of hacking, except it required more finger stamina and fewer basement-dwelling programmers. And let's not forget the poor souls who had to learn Morse code. Operators memorized the entire alphabet, punctuation, and even special procedural signals. The speed demons could tap out 30 or more words per minute, their fingers flying faster than a Victorian court stenographer. The rest of us would probably spend 15 minutes just trying to spell hi, and heaven forbid you wanted to send a love letter. By the time you finished tapping "Dearest Margaret, my heart belongs to you," Margaret would have not only received it, but also moved on, had 3 children, and learned to knit sweaters for all of them. One of the charming quirks of wireless Morse was how personal it became. Operators often recognized each other's fists, their unique rhythm and style of tapping. It was like a digital fingerprint. Long before digital anything existed, you could identify a fellow operator not just by what they sent, but how they sent it. If your style was sloppy, you were the radio equivalent of having bad handwriting. Somewhere out there, an operator was probably rolling their eyes and muttering, "Ugh, it's that guy again, can't even send a clean cue." Now, was wireless telegraphy perfect? Absolutely not. Static, interference, and weather could garble messages. Sometimes signals overlapped, creating a chaotic beep orchestra that made no sense to anyone. Picture trying to hold a serious conversation while 10 people shout random syllables into your ear at the same time. Operators had to develop nerves of steel just to sift meaning from the mess. But despite its flaws, this was nothing short of a communications revolution. Ships were safer, governments were faster, armies were deadlier, and the world got a little smaller, carried on the backs of dots and dashes. For a while, it really seemed like Morse code would dominate the airwaves forever. After all, it worked, it was efficient, and it didn't require inventing brand new technology for every letter of the alphabet. Of course, the future had other plans. Before long, voices would join the dots and dashes, and music would pour from radios like never before. But in this chapter of history, static and beeps were king. It might not have been entertainment, but it was revolutionary. And sometimes, revolution sounds like nothing more than a polite beep. So yes, podcasts may keep you company now, but in 1910, your only podcast was a tired operator tapping out, "We are fine, stop. The captain is grumpy, stop." Not exactly riveting content, but hey, at least it kept you alive. Up to this point, radio had been a noisy world of beeps, sparks, and Morse code. Useful? Yes. Entertaining? About as much as watching paint dry in Morse code. But then came one of those turning points in history where technology takes a wild leap, and suddenly people are hearing things they never thought possible. Enter Reginald Fessenden, a Canadian inventor who believed wireless communication didn't have to sound like a mechanical woodpecker hammering into your skull. While most people were still busy perfecting the art of rapid-fire dot-dash messaging, Fessenden was daydreaming. What if, instead of beeping letters at each other, we could actually talk through the air? To his peers, this was like suggesting we teleport bread instead of baking it. But Fessenden wasn't just a dreamer, he was stubborn enough to actually try. By 1900, he had already achieved something extraordinary. He transmitted a voice over the air, telling his assistant across the yard, 1, 2, 3, 4. "Is it snowing where you are, Mr. Thiessen?" This might not sound impressive now, but at the time it was nothing short of miraculous. It was the first time anyone had used radio waves to transmit speech instead of dots and dashes. Unfortunately, the audio was so scratchy it probably sounded like someone gargling gravel. Still, the idea was planted. The real show, however, came on Christmas Eve, 1906. Fessenden decided to host what we might call the first ever radio broadcast. Instead of a news bulletin or urgent instructions, he chose a mix of culture, religion, and personal flair. He read from the Bible, played a violin solo of "O Holy Night," and broadcast a phonograph recording of Handel. The audience? A scattered handful of wireless telegraph operators sitting in lonely stations along the Atlantic seaboard, wearing headphones and expecting nothing more than the usual Morse code chatter. Imagine their shock when, instead of the expected beeps, they suddenly heard a human voice crackling through the static, followed by music. One operator later recalled the eerie feeling of hearing what sounded like a phantom orchestra drifting through his headset. Many of them thought their equipment had gone haywire, or more dramatically, that ghosts had decided to put on a holiday concert. After all, nothing screams paranormal activity quite like a violin sneaking through static at midnight. For context, this was years before radio receivers were common household items. These weren't families huddled around a radio set. They were professional telegraph operators with bulky gear, sitting alone, probably drinking too much coffee, and suddenly being serenaded by an invisible violinist. If Spotify launched this way today, people would assume the app was haunted, and uninstall it immediately. Now, was the audio quality good? Absolutely not. Think less concert hall and more neighbor playing violin in the apartment above while vacuuming. The early transmitters were unstable, the microphones crackled, and sometimes the signal fizzled out entirely. But quality wasn't the point. Possibility was. Fessenden had just proven that radio didn't have to be limited to beeps and blips. It could carry music, speech, and emotion. Suddenly, the airwaves weren't just a telegraph without wires, they were a stage. Naturally, not everyone was thrilled. Some radio traditionalists thought this was a waste of time. Morse code was efficient, reliable, and universally understood. Who needed fiddly human voices cluttering up the airwaves with their unpredictable accents, mistakes, and, God forbid, opinions? Others saw it differently. If you could transmit music and speech, you could potentially broadcast to entire audiences at once. The seeds of entertainment radio were planted that night, even if no one yet realized just how massive it would become. But let's pause for a funny thought experiment. Imagine you're one of those early operators sitting in a dark shack, expecting another boring night of listening to ... Suddenly, a violin bursts into your ears. Do you panic? Do you assume you're losing your mind? Or do you shrug and say, well, at least it's better than another message about shipping delays? For some, that night must have been equal parts awe-inspiring and terrifying. It wasn't just the sound, it was the idea that human voices were now traveling invisibly through the air. That was the stuff of fairy tales and seances, not science. The Christmas Eve broadcast has since been called the birth of radio broadcasting. Fessenden himself wasn't exactly showered with fame. He didn't become a household name like Marconi, but his experiment was groundbreaking. He showed the world that radio wasn't just for emergencies and ship-to-shore updates. It could be something more human. It could be art. Of course, the technology was still rough, and it would take years before broadcasts became regular events. But once the genie was out of the bottle, there was no stuffing it back in. Soon others would pick up where Fessenden left off, experimenting with concerts, news bulletins, and even comedy sketches. What began as one lonely violin scratching out "Oh Holy Night" would eventually become the full-blown golden age of radio, with entire families gathered around their living rooms to listen to dramas, music, and news. But let's give Fessenden his due. Without his Christmas Eve experiment, the world might have waited much longer to discover radio's potential as entertainment. Instead of holiday music floating across the static, radio might have stayed a serious utilitarian tool for Morse code messages about weather reports and shipping schedules. Not exactly something you'd call theater of the imagination. So the next time your car radio plays static between stations, think of those lonely telegraph operators in 1906, convinced their headsets were possessed by a polite ghost with a violin. Static wasn't just noise, it was the birth cry of modern broadcasting. By the 1920s, radio had officially grown up. Gone were the lonely telegraph operators tapping away in Morse code, and gone were the days of wondering whether that ghostly violin in your headset was divine or diabolical. Now, radio was moving into the living room. For the first time, families across the world could gather around a wooden box with knobs and tubes and feel connected to a shared cultural moment. Imagine it. A big, clunky radio set the size of a small refrigerator, humming and glowing faintly, while the entire household sat in a semicircle around it like worshippers at a technological altar. The father fiddled with the dial, the mother shushed the children, and everyone leaned in, waiting for the evening program to begin. It was the campfire of the 20th century, except instead of roasting marshmallows, you got static news bulletins and a soap opera about someone named Mildred who wouldn't stop fainting dramatically. The first regularly scheduled commercial broadcast began in the early 1920s, and within a decade, radio wasn't just a novelty, it was the entertainment medium. News came directly into homes faster than newspapers could print it. Sports events could be followed live, complete with excited announcers who made even a dull inning sound like the fate of humanity depended on it. And then there was entertainment, comedy shows, serial dramas, mysteries, music programs, and soap operas. Speaking of soap operas, they were literally called that because soap companies sponsored them. Picture it. You're listening to a heartbreaking love triangle, and right when the heroine is about to confess her forbidden love, a cheerful announcer breaks in to sell you laundry powder. Subtlety was not the strong suit of early advertising, but it worked. Housewives tuned in religiously, kids got hooked on adventure serials, and suddenly radio wasn't just background noise, it was a central part of daily life. And oh, the comedies. One of the biggest stars of the radio age was Jack Benny, whose deadpan timing and running gags made millions of listeners chuckle in their living rooms. Radio comedy had to rely entirely on timing, sound effects, and imagination. A door creaking open, that was a microphone operator with a rusty hinge. A punch in the face, usually a slab of meat being smacked around backstage. It was cheap, effective, and sometimes funnier than the joke itself. Then there were the mysteries and thrillers, programs that turned bedrooms into haunted houses with nothing but sound. The Shadow became iconic with its chilling line, "Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows." Millions of children hid under blankets while listening, half terrified, half addicted. Today you can scroll past thousands of horror movies on streaming platforms, but in the 1930s all you needed for nightmares was a creepy voice on the radio and a stormy night. Radio also shaped politics in ways never seen before. Suddenly, leaders weren't just distant names in the newspaper, they were voices in your living room. Franklin D. Roosevelt mastered this with his famous fireside chats, speaking calmly to the nation during the Great Depression and World War II. People described it as if the president were sitting in their home, reassuring them personally that everything would be okay. Never before had a leader's voice reached so intimately into daily life. And then of course came the most infamous moment in radio's golden age, Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast in 1938. For those who missed the opening disclaimer or tuned in late, it sounded like a real news report describing Martians landing in New Jersey. Listeners panicked, some packed up their cars and fled, others armed themselves against non-existent aliens. Meanwhile, Orson Welles was in the studio, blissfully unaware he had just caused one of the greatest mass freakouts in modern history. Radio, it turned out, was so powerful that it could make people believe Earth was under attack because if the radio said it, it must be true. The technical side of radio during this era also deserves a nod. Radios ran on vacuum tubes, which meant they were temperamental beasts. Warm them up too much and they'd fizzle. Tune too far and you'd get ear-splitting static or worse, your neighbor's ham radio chatter. But despite these quirks, families treated their radios like prized possessions. Some even decorated them with doilies because nothing says cutting-edge technology like grandma's lace. Perhaps the most charming part of the golden age was how communal it was. Unlike today's personalized playlists and private earbuds, radio was a shared experience. The whole family listened together. Neighbors talked about last night's program the next morning. Children imitated their favorite radio heroes on the playground. It was mass culture in a way the world had never experienced before. Now, let's bring in the humor. Radio in this era was basically Netflix before Netflix, except there was no skip intro button, no binge watching, and no algorithm recommending other shows you might like. Instead, you tuned in at a specific time, prayed the static wasn't too bad, and if you missed an episode too bad, your friends would spoil it at school the next day, and you'd have no choice but to nod along like you knew what happened. Still, for all its flaws, radio in the 1920s through the 1940s was magic. It turned invisible waves into laughter, fear, music, and connection. It made presidents sound like friends, comedians sound like neighbors, and Martians sound terrifyingly real. In a world without television or smartphones, this glowing wooden box in the living room was the beating heart of modern life. So the next time you complain about buffering on Netflix, spare a thought for your grandparents. They didn't just wait 30 seconds for a video to load. They waited all week for a 30-minute program, then sat in silence while static screamed in their ears, and they loved every minute of it. If radio had been a polite parlor guest in the 1920s, sipping tea and telling stories by the 1940s, it had been drafted, handed a helmet, and shipped straight to the front lines. World War II didn't just use radio, it depended on it. For the first time in history, the human voice could cross oceans in seconds, and leaders, soldiers, and ordinary citizens clung to that invisible lifeline like it was oxygen. The global conflict didn't just play out on the battlefield, it crackled and hummed across the airwaves, and sometimes the drama unfolding in your living room via your wooden radio cabinet was just as nerve-wracking as the real battle outside. Few leaders understood radio's magic like Winston Churchill. His speeches weren't just words, they were morale injections delivered directly into the veins of a weary Britain. He stood in a studio, cigar smoke curling through the air, while his gravelly voice turned phrases like, "We shall fight on the beaches," into national battle cries. Franklin D. Roosevelt did something similar with his fireside chats. These weren't dry political statements but warm conversations, the kind you might expect from a kindly uncle with unusually strong opinions on fascism. Americans gathered around their sets to hear him explain what was happening and why the nation had to pull together. His calm tone soothed nerves, even as the headlines screamed about Pearl Harbor and troop movements. For both leaders, radio wasn't just a tool, it was a stage, and the audience wasn't a crowd in a theater. It was millions of scattered, anxious listeners, each clinging to a voice in the dark. Of course, the Allies weren't the only ones using radio. The Axis powers had their own arsenal of propaganda broadcasters. In Germany, Joseph Goebbels orchestrated a symphony of misinformation, flooding the air with messages designed to crush enemy morale. Radios in occupied countries often carried Nazi broadcasts filled with ominous news, stirring music, and chilling commentary. Then there was Tokyo Rose, a name applied to several female English-speaking broadcasters in Japan. Allied soldiers stationed in the Pacific would tune in, half annoyed and half amused, as she tried to demoralize them with tales of girlfriends cheating back home and doom awaiting their missions. Did it work? Mostly it annoyed soldiers who responded with, "Nice try, but we're keeping the radio on for the music." In Europe, Axis Sally played a similar role, a seductive voice weaving propaganda between swing records. She wanted to erode morale, but many GIs listened simply because radio was scarce, and the music was good even if it came with a side of psychological warfare. Beyond propaganda, radio became the ultimate tool for espionage. Resistance groups scattered across Europe received coded transmissions from London. Imagine listening to the BBC and hearing, "The tulips bloom in Paris tonight." To an ordinary citizen, that might sound like poetry. To a resistance fighter, it meant, "Blow up that railway bridge at midnight." The genius of these codes lay in their simplicity. A few innocuous-sounding words embedded in a broadcast could move armies, derail trains, or sabotage factories. The Germans knew these messages were being sent, but deciphering them in time was like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. Meanwhile, spies carried tiny transmitters, sending bursts of Morse code across borders. They risked everything, knowing enemy radio detection trucks prowled cities like wolves, triangulating signals to track down clandestine operators. One slip, one extra second on air, and the knock on the door would come. War is grueling. But radio also brought moments of escape. In the trenches, on ships, and in barracks, soldiers tuned into music, comedy shows, and messages from home. The BBC's broadcasts weren't just stern reports of battles. They included variety hours, big band swing, and programs designed to remind people what normal life sounded like. For American troops, the Armed Forces radio service kept morale alive. Swinging tunes, light-hearted banter, and familiar voices bridged the gap between the battlefield and home. One day you might hear Glenn Miller's orchestra, another day a cheerful comedian reminding you that somewhere far away, people were still laughing. Funny enough, the uncertainty of radio sometimes meant soldiers didn't know whether the next sound would be a jazz number or an urgent code. Imagine leaning back to enjoy Duke Ellington, only for the announcer to suddenly order sabotage operations in the French countryside. Entertainment and espionage, all mixed together in one strange wartime playlist. Radio in Wajubi created something unprecedented, a shared global ear. For the first time, people on opposite sides of the planet could listen to the same events as they unfolded. You weren't just hearing about the war days later in the newspaper. You were experiencing it live through voices, music, and breaking news bulletins. This immediacy gave radio incredible emotional weight. A mother in London could hear the same Churchill speech as her son on the front. A soldier in North Africa could hear Bing Crosby croon the same song as his sweetheart back in Chicago. It shrank the world, even while the war tried to tear it apart. And yes, radio in wartime had its absurd side. Soldiers sometimes misheard coded messages and went charging off to sabotage the wrong bridge. Families at home leaned forward eagerly, only to hear the dreaded hiss of static right when the Prime Minister reached the climactic line. And of course, nothing quite matched the paranoia of tuning in, wondering if today's program was going to be a jazz tune or an order to blow something up. Radio had gone from crackly entertainment to a weapon of war, and by the end of the conflict its power was undeniable. The war might have been fought with tanks and planes, but it was narrated, directed, and sometimes even manipulated through radio waves. If the story of radio were a TV show, by the late 20th century critics would have been saying, "Great run, but time to cancel." Television had arrived. MTV was hypnotizing teens with moving pictures of mullets, and later the internet would sneak in like the new kid at school who suddenly knew all the answers. But radio didn't get cancelled. It just swapped costumes, tried out some new accents, and kept showing up to the party like that one relative who refuses to believe they're not the center of attention anymore. By the mid-20th century, FM radio was the scrappy underdog of the airwaves. AM had been the reigning champ for decades, but FM stereo came swaggering in with higher fidelity. That meant your favorite saxophone solo no longer sounded like a cat stuck in a tin can. For music lovers, FM was a revelation. Suddenly, rock, pop, and jazz could be heard without the background static that made every guitar riff sound like it was fighting with a thunderstorm. Imagine teenagers in the 1960s finally realizing their radios weren't haunted. The music was supposed to sound like that. Then came the talk radio boom. If FM was about music, AM reinvented itself as the place for people who really loved talking. Sports debates, political rants, late-night conspiracy theories about lizard people. AM became the kingdom of opinions. For insomniacs at 2 a.m., tuning in could mean hearing someone argue passionately about crop circles. Who needs sleep when you can have static-filled existential dread? The invention of the car radio made sure nobody ever had to suffer a quiet commute again. Suddenly, your drive to work wasn't just honking and existential regret. It was accompanied by traffic updates, top 40 countdowns, and disc jockeys whose voices made you wonder, do they actually look cool, or is this a face-for-radio situation? Either way, the car and the radio became inseparable, like peanut butter and jelly. If jelly sometimes interrupted your music with 5 minutes of mattress commercials. But not everyone played by the rules. Enter the pirate radio stations. These were rogue broadcasters, often blasting rock and roll or other unacceptable content from ships, basements, or makeshift antennas duct taped to rooftops. Governments frowned upon them, which only made teenagers love them more. Pirate radio was the ultimate rebellion. You weren't just listening to music, you were sticking it to the man. If you got caught tuning in, the worst that could happen was your mum yelling at you for corrupting your ears, which frankly was worth it to hear The Who at full blast. Fast forward to the 1990s and 2000s, and radio faced its greatest nemesis, the internet. Suddenly, you didn't need to wait for your favorite DJ to play that one song. You could just download it, assuming your dial-up connection didn't crash first. Radio stations started streaming online, proving that if you can't beat the internet, you might as well hitch a ride on its Wi-Fi. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept radio relevant. Then, just when it seemed like radio was finally fading into background noise, along came the podcast revolution. If traditional radio was a big dinner party, podcasts were like a billion tiny dinner tables where anyone could pull up a chair. Want to hear a 10-part series on medieval bread making? There's a podcast for that. Curious about the political philosophy of sock puppets? Yep, there's probably a podcast too. The beauty of podcasts is that you don't need FCC approval, a massive transmitter, or even pants. Just a microphone, a laptop, and a dream. Of course, modern technology also gave us the rise of the smart speaker. Now you can casually yell into your living room, "Alexa, play a radio station," and voila, it does. But deep down, everyone knows it's not the same as your grandfather fiddling with a dial in 1932, trying to catch a weather report through static while shouting, "Did he just say rain or Spain?" Smart speakers don't make you earn it, they just hand over the goods, which is both convenient and a little soul-crushing for those who appreciate the drama of static. And let's not forget satellite radio, which promised to end the tyranny of local stations and their endless car dealership ads. With hundreds of channels, you could drive across the country and never lose your signal or your sanity. The only catch? You had to pay for it? Imagine explaining that to someone in the 1930s. Yes, the radio still works, but now it's a subscription, like newspapers but more expensive and with fewer crossword puzzles. Today, radio is a shapeshifter. It's in your car, in your earbuds, on your phone, and in that smart speaker plotting world domination in your kitchen. It's not the singular cultural force it once was, but it refuses to vanish. Instead, it adapted, trading vacuum tubes for algorithms and static for streaming. The funny thing? Even with the technology at our fingertips, millions still tune into good old-fashioned radio every day. Maybe it's the charm of not choosing the song yourself. Maybe it's the human connection of hearing a DJ's voice break up your commute. Or maybe it's because nothing quite beats the thrill of screaming at the radio, "Not this song again," while driving 70 miles an hour down the highway. So, is radio dead? Not even close. It's alive, well, and living under an assumed identity. From static to streaming, from family hearths to Bluetooth speakers, radio has shown us that it doesn't need to be the star. It just needs to be there. Because whether it's 1932 or 2025, nothing makes life feel less lonely than a familiar voice cutting through the noise, reminding you that yes, it's going to rain today, and no, they're not talking about Spain. Beer is older than your grandmother's complaints about kids these days. In fact, it might be the original excuse for humans abandoning the carefree life of hunting and gathering to settle down and farm. Forget the romantic vision of golden wheat fields swaying in the breeze. Some historians argue that humanity's first cultivated crops weren't just about bread, they were about beer. Bread feeds you, but beer makes you forget that you're living in a mud hut with no plumbing. Priorities, indeed. The story begins somewhere around 5,000, 7,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, where someone left a bowl of grain porridge out in the sun a little too long. Nature did what nature does. Wild yeast floated in, fermentation happened, and the sloppy mess started bubbling. Most people might have looked at this fizzy, sour sludge and said, absolutely not. But one brave soul took a sip and discovered that it made them feel, well, fantastic. A little dizzy, a little warm, a little more tolerant of their noisy neighbors. Thus, beer was born. Not from a genius invention, but from a mistake. Humanity's greatest achievements always seem to start that way. Now, before you scoff at the idea of ancient people chugging beer all day, remember, their water supply wasn't exactly sparkling clean. Rivers doubled as bathtubs, dishwashers, and unfortunately latrines. Beer, however, went through a process of boiling and fermentation that killed off dangerous bacteria. In other words, drinking beer was literally safer than drinking water. Children drank it, workers drank it, priests drank it. If you were alive in Mesopotamia and not sipping beer, you were probably dead from dysentery. Beer wasn't just liquid courage, it was liquid divinity. The Sumerians, one of the earliest civilizations, considered it a gift from the gods. They even had a goddess of beer, Ninkasi. Imagine being so important to society that people wrote hymns to you, not for saving souls or leading armies, but for brewing a decent pint. One surviving text, the hymn to Ninkasi, doubles as both a prayer and a recipe for beer. It describes the process step by step, mashing bread made from barley, mixing it with water, fermenting it, and filtering the result through reed straws. It's basically the world's oldest cookbook. And unlike most cookbooks today, it skips the long personal essay about childhood summers and gets straight to the point. The role of beer went far beyond simple hydration. It shaped economies. Barley wasn't just food, it was currency. Workers, including those building the first cities and temples, were often paid in daily rations of beer. Imagine finishing a long day of hauling bricks under the scorching Mesopotamian sun and receiving your paycheck in the form of a jug of beer. Suddenly, that pyramid scheme doesn't sound so bad. Beer also brought people together. Early tavern-like establishments popped up, where neighbors could sit, gossip, and argue over whose goat was eating whose crops, all while sipping the same cloudy brew. These communal spaces were some of the first social institutions. Long before coffee houses and pubs, civilization quite literally had a bar tab. The pursuit of better beer may have even driven technological advances. To make beer, you needed reliable agriculture, storage vessels, and brewing tools. Pottery jars were developed not just for holding grain, but for fermenting and storing the precious liquid. Archaeologists have found vessels with beer residue dating back thousands of years, proving that wherever humans went, beer followed. In a way, the desire for a steady pint might have been one of the most powerful motivators behind the rise of organized farming. Bread may have been the respectable face of agriculture, but beer was the wild party in the back room. Beer wasn't just for casual sipping, it was deeply embedded in ritual. Religious ceremonies often included offerings of beer to the gods, and some festivals practically revolved around it. Think of it as divine happy hour. Priests and priestesses would pour beer libations, believing the gods themselves enjoyed a drink or two. After all, if humans liked it this much, surely the immortals did as well. Beer was also tied to law and order. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest legal documents, contains regulations about taverns and beer sales. For example, if a tavern keeper watered down beer, the punishment could be death. Harsh, yes, but you can see why they took it so seriously. Nothing ruins a civilization's morale faster than a weak pint. Here's the kicker. There's a strong case to be made that humanity didn't invent agriculture for bread, as we were taught in school, but for beer. Bread is practical, sure, but it doesn't give you that fuzzy warmth in your belly after a long day. Beer, on the other hand, turns sitting around a fire into a party. It turns strangers into friends and problems into songs. In other words, beer may have been the real driving force behind civilization. Humanity's first bad decision, perhaps, but it was also one of its most influential. So, in the dawn of civilization, beer wasn't just a drink, it was survival, currency, religion, law, and community, all poured into one ceramic jug, or turned grain into something divine, messy porridge into culture, and humanity's thirst into history. Before we built palaces or empires, before we discovered philosophy or astronomy, we discovered beer, and for better or worse, we've been raising our glasses ever since. When you picture ancient Egypt, you probably imagine towering pyramids, golden pharaohs, and eyeliner so sharp it could slice papyrus. What you might not imagine is beer frothy, cloudy, warm, and flowing like the Nile itself. Yet if you traveled back to the banks of the Nile around 2500 BCE, you'd find Egyptians drinking more beer than water. Quite literally, beer was Egypt's lifeblood, fueling workers, soothing priests, and even following citizens into the afterlife. Forget the image of Egyptian grandeur for a moment. At its core, the civilization was powered by a river and a whole lot of barley brew. Beer in Egypt wasn't a luxury. It was the staple of life. Known as hyket or zythos, it was thick, filling, and more like liquid bread than the crisp golden pint you know today. Made from crumbled loaves of partially baked barley bread, soaked in water and left to ferment, it had a porridge-like consistency, cloudy appearance, and low alcohol content. In fact, the Egyptians often drank it through straws to avoid swallowing floating lumps of grain and yeast. Yes, Imagine sipping your daily calorie intake through what looks like a straw at a kid's birthday party. Delicious. But here's the thing. Beer was safer than water. The Nile was sacred, yes, but it was also full of crocodiles, hippos and bacteria that could ruin your week faster than a cursed scarab. Beer's fermentation process killed off harmful microbes, making it the go-to drink for rich and poor alike. Children drank it, adults drank it, and even priests drank it in temples, though the gods probably got first dibs. Now, let's talk about those famous pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Giza wasn't built on sheer brute force alone. It was built on beer. Archaeologists have uncovered records showing that workers received rations of bread, onions, and most importantly beer as part of their payment. A common wage was about 4 to 5 liters per day per worker. That's the equivalent of a generous six-pack, except lukewarm and vaguely resembling chunky barley chowder. This wasn't just a perk, it was essential. Beer provided hydration, nutrition, and enough calories to keep thousands of laborers hauling limestone under the blistering desert sun. So yes, the pyramids are one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements, but they're also the world's largest monument to the power of free beer. Funny enough, when you think about it, these men weren't paid in exposure like modern interns. They were paid in beer. Honestly, it might still be the better deal. Beer wasn't just for the living. It had a sacred role in religion. Egyptians believed beer was a divine gift, and offerings of beer were left at temples for the gods to enjoy. Beer was also placed in tombs so that the dead could drink in the afterlife. Imagine planning your eternal retirement and thinking, I'll need my golden mask, my favorite sandals, and a few barrels of barley slush, please. The goddess Hathor, patron of love, music, and dance, was also associated with drunkenness and merriment. Beer festivals in her honor involved copious amounts of drinking, music, and general chaos. One myth even claims that beer saved humanity. When the goddess Sekhmet nearly destroyed the world in a fit of bloodlust, the gods tricked her into drinking vats of beer dyed red to look like blood. She got drunk, passed out, and the world survived. Ancient Egypt, proof that hangovers have occasionally saved civilization. Here's something that might surprise you. In ancient Egypt, brewing was primarily women's work. Just as women baked bread in households, they also brewed beer. The art of fermentation was seen as an extension of domestic responsibilities, but it was also a respected skill. Women brewed both at home for family consumption and on a larger scale for temples and palaces. Depictions in tomb paintings often show women involved in the brewing process, mashing grain, straining liquid, and storing the brew in tall clay jars. Some women even became professional brewers, earning status in a world where most economic power belonged to men. So if you've ever raised a glass at happy hour, you might want to toast not just the beer but the women of the Nile who perfected the recipe thousands of years ago. Beer was truly universal in Egypt, but it wasn't all the same. The wealthy often had access to finer, smoother brews made with better ingredients, while commoners drank the thick, hearty stuff. Pharaohs enjoyed beer alongside imported wines, but they never turned their noses up at a decent pint. Records even show that pharaohs established large-scale breweries to keep up with demand. After all, nothing says divine ruler like the ability to flood your kingdom with endless kegs of beer. Beer was woven into the fabric of Egyptian life. It sustained workers, played a role in religion, elevated women's contributions, and connected all classes of society. Without beer, it's not an exaggeration to say that the Egypt we know, the pyramids, the temples, even the myths might not have existed in the same way. The Egyptians built their world on sand, stone, and barley suds. And the funny part? Imagine showing up for your first day at pyramid construction. Instead of filling out paperwork, you're handed a ceramic jug of frothy porridge beer and told, this is your paycheck. Honestly, not the worst first-day orientation package. The Middle Ages were, in many ways, a damp and slightly yeasty chapter in European history. Damp because everything was soggy, castles, shoes, the weather, and yeasty because beer became the beverage that kept people alive. Bread filled the belly, but beer filled the gaps, literally. since medieval water sources were often teeming with microbes that could fell a man faster than a knight's broadsword. Brewing was not just an occasional pastime, it was the pulse of daily life, woven into both the sacred and the ordinary. And in this era, two groups became unlikely business partners in beer's expansion: monks and alewives. Together, they created a culture of brewing that would shape Europe's thirst for centuries. Monasteries were the Michelin star breweries of their day. From the 9th century onward, monks were busily brewing in cloisters from France to Bavaria, and not just because they enjoyed a pint after Vespers. Beer was part of their spiritual and economic mission. Unlike the chaotic, home-based brewing happening in towns, monastic beer was prized for its cleanliness, consistency, and, let's be honest, the fact that monks had plenty of time to tinker with recipes between chanting, copying manuscripts, and contemplating the mysteries of God. For them, brewing wasn't only about refreshment, it was part of Christian hospitality. Pilgrims and weary travelers could expect not just a place to rest, but also a hearty mug of ale. In some cases, the beer brewed in monasteries was so well regarded that it became a source of revenue, with surplus sold to the public. But while the monks were experimenting with brewing techniques across villages and towns of Europe, the alewife was queen of the kettle. Long before pubs dotted every street corner, it was women, often widows or wives looking to supplement family income, who brewed small batches at home to sell to neighbors. Brewing was considered part of the domestic economy, no more unusual than baking bread or tending the garden. Alewives would hang out a sign, often a broom or ale stake, to let the community know a fresh batch was ready. This was a casual, community-driven model, but don't let that fool you. It was also a crucial one, because for many households, beer was the main calorie intake after bread. Of course, any time women held economic power in medieval Europe, suspicion lurked nearby. Alewives were sometimes accused of witchcraft, not least because brewing looked an awful lot like a cauldron bubbling with mysterious ingredients. Add to that the broom symbol outside their homes, cats hanging around to keep mice out of the grain, and some questionable marketing. A few may have watered down their ale, and suddenly the humble brewer became the villain of local gossip. The image of the alewife, with her pointed hat, actually just a tall brewing hat used to stand out in a crowd, cauldron and cat, may have been one of the seeds that grew into the stereotypical witch we know today. So next Halloween, when you see a witch costume, remember you might just be looking at the ghost of a hard-working medieval brewer. While monks and alewives were refining the art of brewing, something else was sneaking into the mug hops. Before hops, medieval beer was often flavored with a mixture called grüt, a blend of herbs and spices that could include everything from bog myrtle to yarrow. The problem was it didn't preserve the beer for long. Once hops entered the brewing scene around the 12th century, everything changed. Hops not only added the bitter tang we now associate with beer, but also acted as a natural preservative, extending shelf life and making it possible to transport beer over longer distances. Suddenly, beer wasn't just a local product, it was a regional and even international trade good. Naturally, this made authorities eager to regulate and tax it, ensuring that the story of beer would forever be tangled with politics. Monastic breweries took hops in stride, using them to create beers that could last longer and be sold further afield, filling church coffers in the process. Alewives were a bit slower to adopt, in part because grüt was often controlled by local authorities who made money from selling it. But once hops caught on, the transformation was undeniable. The transition also marks one of the big divides in beer culture. The sweeter, grüt-based ales gave way to the bitter, hop-forward beers that dominate today. Through all of this, beer remained deeply embedded in daily life. Workers drank it, children drank it, nobles drank it. It was the democratic drink that cut across class. But perhaps the funniest image of all comes from the cloisters. Monks crafting beers so potent that fasting days, which happened often in the medieval calendar, became surprisingly bearable. Liquid bread wasn't just a metaphor. Some monastic brews had enough calories to keep a friar plump, even without solid food. One can only imagine prayer time after a few too many tankards. Gregorian chant drifting off-key, theological debates turning heated, and at least one brother insisting he'd just seen a vision after downing the triple fermented batch. So, in the medieval era, beer evolved from survival drink to refined craft. The monks elevated it to art, the alewives made it an everyday staple, and hops gave it a durability that would ensure its survival for centuries to come. It was no longer just a messy accident of fermentation. It was culture, community, and commerce in a mug. And whether in a cathedral cloister or a smoky village kitchen, the medieval pint was already pointing the way toward the future of beer. If you thought beer was just a cozy medieval indulgence, think again. By the time the age of exploration rolled around in the 15th and 16th centuries, beer had hitched a ride across oceans and was fast becoming the unofficial companion of sailors, colonists, and explorers. Forget maps, compasses, and divine guidance. If the ship ran out of beer, morale plummeted, tempers flared, and voyages risked turning into floating nightmares. Beer, in other words, was as essential to colonization as sails, cannons, and a vague sense of destiny. Explorers carried barley, yeast, and brewing knowledge wherever they went. On long Atlantic crossings, fresh water spoiled quickly, but beer, particularly low-alcohol small beer, was remarkably durable. It kept sailors hydrated safely, provided calories, and offered a daily comfort in the form of warm, foamy porridge in a mug. This practical function aside, beer also became a symbol of European civilization abroad. In the New World, a properly brewed pint meant order, refinement, and the comforting illusion of home. It was a floating embassy of culture. Yes, we may be storm-tossed, disease-ridden, and slightly mutinous, but at least we have ale. The Pilgrim's Voyage to Plymouth provides one of the most amusing anecdotes in colonial beer history. Legend has it that part of the reason they decided to land when they did wasn't because of sacred divine intervention, nor out of careful navigation. It was because their beer supply was running dangerously low. You can imagine the captain yelling, "Land ho!" Also, "We're out of beer." If nothing else, this puts a whole new spin on the phrase settling for survival. Beer dictated timelines, colonization patterns, and possibly even international treaties in ways we often overlook. A lost barrel of ale could change the course of history. Once the colonies were established, beer became an economic and social staple. Taverns sprouted up as hubs of community life, much like the alehouses of Europe, but with the added flavor of the New World. These were not merely places to sip. Taverns functioned as post offices, marketplaces, and town halls. Business was conducted over frothy mugs. Political debates raged between sips, and local news circulated in the form of whispers and ale-fueled gossip. To be part of colonial society, you had to understand the language of beer, how strong it was, who brewed it, and how quickly it should be consumed before it went off. However, beer wasn't the only spirit making waves. Rum, imported from Caribbean sugar plantations, and stronger liquors challenged beer's supremacy. Colonists faced a choice: hearty, frothy ale that sustained the body, or stronger, more intoxicating spirits that lubricated conversations and led to entirely new forms of recreational chaos. In places like New England, this resulted in a drinking hierarchy, with beer as the everyday staple and rum reserved for celebrations, trade negotiations, and naval mutinies. The tension between beer and spirits shaped drinking culture in the colonies, and even inspired early temperance debates centuries before they became fashionable. Colonial brewing was also a story of adaptation. European recipes had to be modified to suit local ingredients and climates. Barley didn't always thrive, water quality varied, wild yeasts sometimes ran amok. This unpredictability led to experimentation, with colonists adding maize, potatoes, or other grains to stretch supplies. The result? Beer became a regional affair, distinct from Old World traditions, yet always carrying that essential European DNA. The interplay of necessity, creativity, and sheer stubbornness defined colonial brewing in a way that no imported cookbook could capture. Beer's cultural weight went beyond practicality. It was a statement, a claim that European settlers could transplant their familiar ways to the wilderness, turning alien landscapes into something vaguely domestic. Taverns functioned as microcosms of society, providing venues for governance, debate, and occasionally riotous fun. Beer was a bridge between continents, a comfort against homesickness, and a subtle assertion of power. Colonization without beer would have been slower, less coordinated, and infinitely grumpier. And yes, the funny side of all this cannot be ignored. Nothing screams New World exploration like realizing you forgot to pack enough six-packs. You've crossed the Atlantic, battled storms, evaded pirates, and endured months of saltwater rations, only to discover that your morale and possibly your sanity is hostage to empty barrels. It's the perfect blend of human ambition and basic necessity. We conquer continents, but first we need our ale. By the end of the colonial period, beer was no longer merely a drink. It was a tool of survival, a social lubricant, and a cultural export. It traveled with explorers, settled into taverns, shaped economies, and became an indispensable part of daily life. Beer proved that sometimes the smallest decisions, like bringing enough barrels for a transatlantic journey, can have the biggest historical impact. From ship decks to Plymouth taverns, beer was as much a passenger on the journey of empire as any captain, soldier, or settler. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the world had changed in ways that no medieval monk or colonial tavern keeper could have imagined. Cities grew taller, smoke hung heavy over factory districts, and human lives became more regimented, measured not by the seasons or church bells, but by the relentless tick of the industrial clock. In the midst of all this chaos, beer didn't just survive, it evolved. It went from being a local artisanal craft to an industrial commodity, a staple of urban working-class culture, and occasionally a hero of morale on factory floors. The Industrial Revolution brought with it technological marvels that would forever alter the brewing process. Thermometers and hydrometers allowed brewers to measure temperatures and sugar content with precision, transforming what had once been a mystical trial-and-error process into a repeatable science. Refrigeration emerged, letting breweries store and ship beer over long distances without it spoiling, and pasteurization, championed by Louis Pasteur himself, dramatically extended shelf life by killing unwanted microbes. What had once been a delicate, perishable liquid became a reliable product ready to meet the demands of a rapidly urbanizing population. These advances, combined with urban population growth, led to the rise of big breweries. No longer was beer a neighborhood affair brewed in someone's kitchen or a monastery cloister. It was now being produced on massive scales. Industrial breweries began pumping out tens of thousands of liters at a time, often under brand names that are still familiar today. Marketing campaigns spread awareness, bottle labels became recognizable icons, and distribution networks allowed beer to flow from city centers to distant towns. The pint was no longer tied to locality. It was everywhere, a symbol of the new industrial era. Urban workers whose lives were dominated by long shifts, dangerous conditions, and regimented schedules embraced beer as both sustenance and respite. Unlike today, beer still carried calories, nutrients, and a small amount of alcohol, making it a practical supplement to the meager rations of the industrial diet. Factory laborers could knock back a mug after a 12-hour day, the hops and barley acting as both reward and mild anesthetic for aching muscles. Beer had transitioned from a sacred or domestic indulgence into a tool for survival in the concrete jungle, fueling the workforce that powered the machines of the new era. The social role of beer also shifted. While medieval taverns had been centers of community life, the industrial pint was tied tightly to urban neighborhoods and the rhythms of factory work. Public houses or pubs remained community hubs, but now they reflected the schedules of the city. Opening hours were tailored to the start and end of shifts, and the clientele was overwhelmingly working class. Beer became a shared language among laborers, a token of solidarity, and a brief escape from the drudgery of assembly lines. It was comfort in a mug, a small rebellion against the mechanical tyranny of industrial life. The humor of this transition is hard to ignore. In monasteries, beer had been a holy offering, blessed and carefully measured, sometimes with elaborate rituals. It was an object of devotion and skill. By contrast, in the factories of Manchester, Berlin and Chicago, beer had become a factory lunch break, a necessary supplement to keep the human engine running. The journey from divine libation to industrial necessity is striking. A monk might have brewed a triple fermented ale with prayers whispered over each vat, while a brewery worker in 1850 was producing barrels of the same drink to line the shelves of local pubs, the devotion now directed to profit margins rather than piety. Industrialization also gave rise to innovation in brewing styles. Lager production expanded with the advent of refrigeration, creating smooth, pale beers that were easier to drink in quantity. Bottling machines allowed beer to leave the cask and enter private homes, expanding consumption beyond the pub. Advertising campaigns emerged, appealing to taste, civic pride, or simple curiosity. Beer was no longer just a drink. It was a marketed commodity, a product of science and machinery as much as barley and hops. And yet, despite its new industrial scale, beer retained its role as a social lubricant, a calorie-dense pick-me-up, and a cultural touchstone. It became the glue holding working-class communities together in the midst of dizzying urban change. In a time of soot, smog, and steam engines, beer remained a small pleasure, a liquid companion in a rapidly transforming world. The Industrial Revolution also laid the groundwork for modern beer culture. Mass production, branding, and distribution were established, creating the framework for the beer giants and craft brewers that would follow. Without this period, beer might have remained a local or religious artifact, confined to kitchens, monasteries, and taverns. Instead, it became a ubiquitous symbol of modern life, accessible to millions, fueling both labor and leisure alike. So in this era, beer transformed from sacred beverage to industrial lifeline, from artisan craft to mass-produced commodity, from a monk's meditation to a factory worker's calorie-packed respite. Holy offerings became lunch breaks, sacred brews became standardized products, and the frothy pint endured as a companion to humanity's march into mechanized modernity. In short, beer survived the Industrial Revolution by adapting, expanding, and never forgetting that its most important job was to make life slightly more tolerable, no matter how grim the factory walls or how long the shift. The 1920s in the United States were supposed to be an era of moral clarity, temperance, and civic virtue. What actually happened, however, was a nationwide experiment in human ingenuity, deception, and the absolute refusal to give up beer. The 18th Amendment, ratified in 1920, outlawed the production, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages, creating what became infamously known as Prohibition. Americans were told to abandon their beloved libations for the supposed sake of public health, social order, and moral uplift. What they got instead was a 13-year masterclass in bootlegging, speakeasy culture, and the creative use of fermented grape juice in the quest for a substitute beverage. At first, the law seemed straightforward: no beer, no wine, no spirits. Enforcement, however, was another story. Across cities and towns, enterprising individuals found ways to keep the nation's thirst at bay. Speakeasies, the secret, password-protected bars that dotted cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston, became the hidden heart of nightlife. Patrons would slip through hidden doors, often behind unassuming storefronts, and enter dimly lit rooms filled with jazz, chatter, and the unmistakable smell of illicit fermentation. In some ways, these secret establishments were more exciting than the pre-Prohibition taverns. The risk of arrest added a thrill to each sip, and the creativity in concealment rivaled any stage magician. Bootleggers rose to prominence during this era, using everything from hidden compartments in cars to secret river routes to transport illicit beer and spirits. Some brewed their own bathtub beer or near beer, a watered-down approximation of what they'd been used to, often barely alcoholic, sometimes barely palatable. Recipes were improvised, fermentation was rushed, and quality was inconsistent. Drinkers often had to develop an adventurous palate, or at least a sense of optimism, to get through the experience. It was not uncommon for a customer to discover that a batch meant to taste like Pilsner ended up more akin to warm, fizzy mud. But the social cachet of participating in something forbidden made even bad beer taste revolutionary. The rise of organized crime was perhaps the most notorious side effect of Prohibition. Figures like Al Capone became infamous for their control over the illegal liquor trade, combining violence, business acumen, and charisma in equal measure. The illegal beer trade provided enormous profits, fueling a black market economy that reached deep into politics, law enforcement, and daily life. Entire police forces and city officials were bribed to turn a blind eye, while gang wars erupted over the control of supply routes. Suddenly, beer wasn't just a beverage, it was a geopolitical asset, capable of sparking battles in urban neighborhoods and boardrooms alike. Home brewing also skyrocketed. Ordinary citizens learned to ferment, distill, and disguise alcohol in their basements, kitchens, and closets. Cookbooks emerged with instructions for creating beer that complied with the letter of the law, if not the spirit. People experimented with ingredients, substitutes, and even flavor enhancers to make legal beverages palatable. The ingenuity of the average American during Prohibition rivaled any modern startup incubator, except instead of launching apps, they were launching barrels of illicit malt. Even when Prohibition ended in 1933 with the 21st Amendment, the beer industry didn't snap back to pre-1920s glory immediately. After years of watering down, fermenting incorrectly, and improvising with strange ingredients, both brewers and drinkers had to relearn what beer was supposed to taste like. Some breweries went under during the dry years, while others adapted too well to shortcuts, leaving consumers with a nostalgic craving for flavors that weren't quite attainable. Beer returned, but the memory of Prohibition lingered, flavoring each pint with the lessons of scarcity, creativity, and rebellion. The humor of the era is undeniable. Americans had collectively decided that beer was a moral hazard and banned it nationwide, only to discover that grape juice, herbal concoctions, and fizzy near beer were hardly acceptable substitutes. Parties, work breaks, and family dinners all suffered from the absence of proper ale. Suddenly, the realization hit. Maybe the civilized act of enjoying fermented barley wasn't such a terrible decision after all. Humanity's oldest bad decision, beer, had been temporarily reversed, and everyone quickly regretted it. Prohibition also left cultural marks that persist today. Jazz, cocktails, and the speakeasy mystique became enduring symbols of rebellion. The criminal networks established during the ban reshaped American cities and law enforcement strategies. And beer itself, tempered by scarcity and criminal enterprise, emerged stronger, more standardized, and more culturally ingrained than ever. The episode proved that outlawing a beloved beverage might control its legality, but it cannot control desire, ingenuity, or the human tendency to find a way around restrictions. In short, Prohibition was a period when beer went underground, both literally and metaphorically. It turned ordinary citizens into amateur brewers, turned gangsters into moguls, and reminded the nation that you can legislate morality, but you can't legislate taste. Americans learned to improvise, innovate, and above all, endure, all while longing for a simple pint. It was a turbulent chapter, filled with creativity, criminality, and the occasional disastrously brewed batch, a reminder that beer's influence is as much cultural and social as it is liquid. By the time the 20th century rolled past its midpoint, beer had fully entrenched itself in modern life, but in ways that would have stunned the monks, colonial settlers, or factory workers who had gone before. After World War II, mass-produced lagers dominated the global market. Light, pale, and relatively easy to drink in quantity, these beers catered to the new suburban lifestyle. Predictable, mild, and designed to appeal to as many palates as possible. The era of local brews, frothy ales, and neighborhood microbreweries had largely been replaced by standardized products coming out of massive industrial facilities. Beer became something you could find on every supermarket shelf, in every gas station cooler, and at every backyard barbecue. It was consistent, accessible, and sometimes, dare we say, boring. But beer culture is nothing if not resilient. By the late 20th century, a counter-movement emerged. Craft brewing began to flourish, initially in small pockets, as homebrewers and passionate entrepreneurs sought to recapture the spirit, complexity, and variety that had been lost in the industrial age. These brewers were driven by creativity, curiosity, and occasionally stubborn rebellion against the homogeneity of mass-produced lagers. Suddenly, beer wasn't just a beverage, it was an artisanal project, a statement and a challenge to your taste buds. You could sip a stout infused with coffee in the morning, or a Belgian triple after dinner, and feel transported not just to another flavor, but to a culture of craft, pride, and historical continuity. The craft revolution also brought with it an explosion of flavor experimentation. IPAs, or India Pale Ales, rose to dominance, flaunting their bitter hops as badges of flavor intensity. But brewers didn't stop there. Humans, always eager to push boundaries, began introducing bizarre and whimsical ingredients: pumpkin spice for seasonal nostalgia, bacon for breakfast enthusiasts, even glitter for those who wanted sparkle with their suds. Some combinations sounded absurd on paper, but the culture of craft brewing encouraged audacity. The motto became, "If you can ferment it, you can drink it." Beer became an ever-changing playground where the only rule was creativity, and consumers were invited to be fearless participants. Modern beer culture also embodies a tension between the global giants and indie microbreweries. Large corporations dominate shelf space, advertising, and distribution, ensuring that certain flagship brands are universally recognizable. Meanwhile, microbreweries carve out niches, building loyal followings through community engagement, unique flavors, and a narrative of authenticity. It's a marketplace that celebrates diversity while maintaining a level of commercial reality. You can drink a glittery IPA from a two-person garage operation, but chances are your local convenience store still has the pale lager that your grandfather bought in the 1960s. Technology continues to shape the beer world as well. Automated brewing systems, temperature-controlled fermentation, and advanced bottling techniques allow both craft and industrial breweries to maintain high quality. Social media has transformed marketing. Beer releases, seasonal specials, and tasting events are broadcast worldwide, creating global communities centered around what was once simply a local staple. The modern beer enthusiast can access information about hops grown in Oregon, yeast strains developed in Belgium, and seasonal ingredients from all over the world, all from the comfort of a smartphone. Humorously, humans have come a long way from that accidental fermented porridge that started it all in Mesopotamia. Civilization began with liquid bread, designed to sustain and hydrate, and here we are centuries later, sipping cupcake-flavored double-hopped artisanal stout while debating aroma notes and mouthfeel. Beer has evolved from a survival tool into a cultural statement, a culinary experiment, and for many, an obsession. The journey from accidental fermentation to glitter beer is a testament not only to human ingenuity, but also to our capacity for indulgence, playfulness, and occasionally absurd taste experiments. Today, beer exists simultaneously as a ubiquitous, everyday beverage and as an artisanal art form. It is consumed casually in kitchens, bars, and sporting arenas, while also being celebrated in tasting rooms, beer festivals, and competitions. Its cultural influence extends globally. Beer festivals bring communities together, brewing competitions showcase innovation, and international beer tourism allows enthusiasts to explore local traditions and histories. It remains a drink that is social, creative, and infinitely adaptable. Ultimately, the modern beer era demonstrates the remarkable flexibility of a simple fermented grain concoction, from sacred offering to industrial staple, from survival drink to experimental artisan product. Beer has endured, evolved, and amused humanity for thousands of years. And while some may debate the merits of pumpkin-spiced or glitter-infused brews, there is no denying that beer, in all its forms, continues to reflect human culture, our ingenuity, our humor, and our eternal love of a well-crafted pint.